Cool. It's story time. Cool, so this is the story about how we took one of our core features at GoGuardian and we tried rebuilding it with artificial intelligence in mind. What's really cool is some of the people in the audience here today were actually part of that story with us, so I'm excited to have you guys here. So, I work for GoGuardian's innovation team, and it's a really small team. It's only got a couple full-time members other than myself, and then the rest, everyone else just works their nights, weekends, one day a week. And it's all because they're super excited about the opportunities in front of us. And the innovation team, one of the things we get to do is we get to start from absolute zero. We're basically given a high-level problem and just told go solve it. So you can imagine if you were going to try to build Uber or self-driving cars, your boss would just come to you and say cars, and then you go from there. And so that's kind of how the innovation team works. So in January of this year, we were given our first project, and that was just activity flagging. So how many of you here know what activity flagging is? Good portion. So for those of you who don't know, the terminology is not convoluted at all. The nomenclature is pretty straightforward. The idea of activity flagging is flagging certain types of student behavior that may be harmful or maybe indications of bad digital citizenship. And so at GoGuardian, we have an activity flagging solution that we call Flagged Activity. Our brand director was involved, the design team was involved, we all got together, got really creative. And so flagged activity at GoGuardian works like most activity flagging algorithms out there, and that is that it's word flagging. And what that means is you take a list of words that you think indicate something, like the word apple, which is a disgusting word, or fruits and vegetables, and you put it on this list of words. And most vendors give you some default list, but usually educators will get together and add words. There's even some school districts that have district-wide meetings that they all look forward to where they talk about what words they want on the list that year. I can't imagine how those meetings go. Anyway, so you have this list of words, and when students go to websites with those list of words, if one of those words is on it, it'll go ahead and generate a flag for it. So what you're seeing here is that original interface where we can see Hermione Granger was being a little inappropriate and going on apple and fruit websites. Cool. So, like I said, our job at GoGuardian was not to just rebuild this, it was to reimagine it. We had to ask ourselves, why do we flag in the first place? What are we actually trying to do with this? And so we talked with customers and non-GoGuardian customers all across the country for months. That's all we did, is we just talked to people. And we figured out there's a high-level process that's involved with most activity flagging, trying to shape this digital citizen and kind of keep students safe. And so it all started with the word being flagged. Or before that, as we mentioned, it started with deciding which words to flag in the first place. And after a word was flagged, an educator would dive into the next step, which is what was the actual content on the website, right? Because the word doesn't necessarily tell you what the content is. We'll go into some more examples of where that gets really fun. So the next step would be, what were they actually looking at? And a lot of times that was hard, right? If you're on Facebook as a student and you go as an admin, you can't see what that student was seeing. And then after that, they'd go into the context step. What were they doing before and after? Some educators would actually spend 30 minutes just pulling in the context, right? Because you're making these decisions that are really going to shape a human being, and you want to make sure to get it right. So once you have those two pieces, the next step would be the behavioral understanding step. You can confidently say, this student was engaging in this type of behavior. And finally, after that, there's an action plan. Usually that's informed by school policy, right? If a student is browsing explicit stuff on the school device, we do X or Y. Sometimes there's interesting enough activity that it requires its own action plan for that unique incident. And finally, you go and you execute the action. And I think an important thing to highlight here is that administrators and educators who took 30 minutes to an hour on each of these incidents, what they really cared about were the students. They were the student's advocate. It was all about shaping the human being. The student didn't see it that way at the time, but that's what it was all about. So anyway, you might notice that, yes, you can see they're different colored. These boxes are different colored. And the reason for that is our next step was to ask, where was text solving the problem, and what was still a manual process by an educator? So here, tech's only job in this whole thing was to flag the words. And after that, it was all up to the educator to solve everything else. So that was an immediate focus area that we looked at. How can we maybe help along this process? And so I kind of want to dive into the first steps of what were the problems we found. So the problem with flagging URLs. I'm sure a bunch of you can kind of understand the problem with flagging URLs. There's two major ones, trying to use URLs as a way to understand behavior. Number one, the amount of content that's generated on the internet every day is absurd nowadays. As Oddbite mentioned, we're in the information era. There's something like 1 million websites created per day. And so if you were to store a list of every website that's created and try to categorize it, not only would you need an army of people to categorize it, you would also have to categorize, you'd have to store millions of websites. And second thing is that the URL no longer equals the content, right? And back when URLs were created, the URL was to a specific resource on the internet. But nowadays, Facebook.com looks different for all of us. It's the exact same URL, different content. And if I have a chat window open on Facebook, that's not represented in the URL. So URLs are not the right way to classify content. And so, as I mentioned, most people turn to word flagging. That's why it exists, is because people know this problem exists. The thing is that word flagging isn't the best solution either. Number one is it generates a lot of false positives. There's a lot of reasons that a word might show up on a website when it might not mean what you think it means. A good example is we noticed at GoGuardian that we had this giant shift in explicit activity during a certain time of the school year. Does anyone have any guesses what time of school year? Health class. That's actually a good one. It's prom. So prom has a bunch of prom dresses that have the word sexy in them. And that's on GoGuardian's default filter list. So this giant spike in explicit activity that looked like the whole world was getting taken over was prom. So it generates a lot of false positives. But yes, sex ed classes as well. The second one is that it also misses a lot, right? One of the things is you're explicitly adding words and trying to match them, meaning if someone uses a 0 instead of an O, or they add an extra D, you need to add all those variations. So I've seen lists before that have every variation of a certain word, a bad word, that could possibly be imagined, I'm guessing from incidents with students, right? But the idea is that it's missing a lot. It's both over-reporting and missing a lot. And to give an idea of how poorly it's over-reporting, we had one school district that we worked with that has 20,000 students. It's a one-to-one district. And they were getting 200,000 notifications per week. So you can do the math of how quick you would have to go through those notifications if you spent all of your 40-hour work week on those notifications, which educators have a lot more to do than that. And if you were one person, you would have to handle 83 notifications per minute, or more than one per second. So even if you hired 4 people, they would still have to handle a notification every 3 seconds. That's not gonna work. So the existing solutions out there were not working. So at this point, we should take a step back and say, what are we actually trying to do here with all of this flagging and everything? And the real thing we're trying to do here is understand content, right? We're trying to take a shortcut to understand what the content on the website is actually about. You don't care that they went on xyz.com, that specific URL. You care that xyz.com has explicit content on it. Just like you don't care about the word hot by itself. It's where it appears in context and what it actually means that you care about. And so this is what you're really trying to do when you have all of these things. And so the next question was, is there a way that we can take all of these things and automate them? Is there a way that we can take this idea of understanding the true content of a website and take it away from the manual process of an educator? And as I mentioned, right now, the only thing that tech helps out with this is just in the word flagging phase. And of course, Oddbite kind of stole my punchline here, but the answer here is artificial intelligence. You can train machines to do all of this. And this was our first project at GoGuardian with AI, was to train machines to do all of this. So we started off with explicit activity. We had educators give us examples. We showed this machine examples from the internet as well. And after a few weeks, we were able to actually, with phenomenal accuracy, be able to determine whether a certain piece of content, no matter what it was of an explicit nature or not. We could tell whether it was a sex ed resource or something much more graphic. And we did the same thing for self-harm. We trained a machine to understand when someone was talking about hurting themselves versus when they were reading a news article or on a website like Suicide Squad. And so after we were done with that, the next step was to say, okay, we have this system that when you show it a content, it's able to tell you what it's about. But we need to make sure we don't fall into the same traps that flagging URLs and flagging words has, which is the content on the internet is constantly changing. How do we make sure that we understand what every student is looking at to make sure that they get the help they need if they need it? And so we actually built a real-time content analysis per student all through AI, meaning every time a student is browsing through the internet, the AI is able to, within milliseconds of the page loading, know what that page is about. And you don't have to take my word for it, though. I can show you. Now, before I show you these examples, I kind of want to give an intro. Both of these examples are reproductions of real incidents that happened. They're both self-harm related. They really kind of show the nature of why you need AI in this equation and how it can be so beneficial. So this first incident here started with a Google search. And within seconds of the search starting, the AI had determined that it was about harming oneself. And so we had an educator tell us about this, which is why we're able to kind of reproduce it. And so there's a really interesting thing to highlight here, and I chose this example specifically because word flagging could have caught this. That's why I chose it. Word flagging could have caught this. You could have had the flagged words kill self, and it would have caught it. The difference is that it also would have caught kill self anywhere else on the internet, all the false positives. Not only that, is that how they fundamentally work is completely different. Flagging words, what it would have done is just look up kill self and seen if it was on the page. What this has actually done is understand the true content of the Google search and able to say, this is a student who's looking to hurt themselves. And that's actually highlighted in this next example. And not only that, this next example takes place in a private place. It's in a Google Doc, meaning that it wasn't accessible to the public. And nowhere does the student talk about any kind of things that would be caught in a word flagging solution. So that's the difference with AI versus word flagging, is now you have something that actually understands what's happening. So I don't think there's a disagreement here on it being better at just understanding what's going on. But the next question we had to ask ourselves is, how much better is it? So remember that school district I told you about previously that had 200,000 notifications per week? After they implemented this latest AI version, they went down to 2,000 notifications per week. That's 100 times decrease, simply by removing all the false positives that were, not real because flagged words isn't as accurate. So after we had built this real-time analysis system that was using AI to categorize every page, as students were browsing it in real time, the next step was to say, what additional context do we need to collect for educators so they can make the critical decision of whether they need to intervene or bring the student in or anything like that. And so we went back to our conversations with educators and we arrived at these 3 high-level topics. 1, the actual content of the website. This is where AI is helping us. What is it about? What did it look like? What does it all mean? Number 2, browsing to and from the website. What were they doing before and after? Did they accidentally click on this link? Is it part of a kind of a browsing session that's really worrisome? And 3, recent incidents that were similar. Is this repeat behavior? Is this something that needs to be escalated? What does it mean? And so we built a UI that was able to show all of this information, including the AI information, to the user. So this is the dashboard of that incident we just looked at. And I can see in this, what we call an alert, that we have all of the information in it, including the category that the AI determined it. Now this is cool. I can actually tell the AI if I got it right or wrong. And depending on the feedback, the AI will get smarter over time. On the left is the behavior log. You can see that not only do we have the context of what they were doing before and after, so here I can see a Google search of I hate my life, and then that was followed by the actual self-harm related searches. And it puts it all in context. There's even screenshots of when the AI determined that this was of a negative behavior, so that there's no question. And here's the actual search that we saw in our reproduction. And finally, if I'm really worried about the student, I can actually go and see all of the incidents that were deemed related of a similar nature. So these are all the incidents that the student also talked about harming themselves. And like I said, this is a reproduction, so it's my name. So cool. We have this process that we outlined, and using AI, we were able to offload a bunch of it onto tech, leaving the educator to start at the behavioral understanding piece. What was the student actually doing? And so if we want to look at it a little bit more accurately, it looks like this. Content and context understanding can be delivered by the AI directly to the educator in real time, allowing the educator to focus on understanding the behavior and developing an action plan, the most crucial parts of this whole thing. This is where decisions are weighed, a final outcome is determined, student behavior is shaped, lives are saved. And for that reason, we're actually going to make sure that stays with the humans. Like I said, this is probably the most critical part of this whole experience. And at GoGuardian, we're very open about what we're good at. We're good at building tools for educators. We are not child psychology experts. We haven't built an AI that knows what's best for every student. We know that the humans are the ones who actually know what's best for each of their students. And so we're leaving that with the educators. Now that said, we are devoted to actually providing as much support as we can. So we've dedicated a team at GoGuardian to creating partnerships with some expert organizations in self-harm, suicide prevention, and even just child psychology in general, to produce resources for parents, educators, and students in case they need any resources that they need distributed. But as I mentioned, we're going to keep this with the humans. Cool. So we've determined the first part we can actually replace with AI. The second part is left up to the humans. But what about the last part? Executing action. So it turns out that a lot of districts have very different action plans, different policies. But those action plans are composed of similar pieces, right? What are the end result of those actions? Email the student, call the parent, bring the student into the office, right? Those are all shared actions, even though maybe the policy is different. And so the next question we had is there a way that we can take all of these actions and allow educators to model their unique action plans so that the AI can trigger them automatically? So we arrived at something called triggers. Triggers are a way for you to set up the AI to automatically take action for you based on the student and based on the type of behavior that they were engaging in. So it works like this. You have some behavior that comes in. Based on the student's OU, and for those of you who don't know what an OU is, based on the groups that they belong to, whether they're in elementary school, whether they're at a certain school, and based on the type of behavior, you can trigger automatic actions, such as automatically assigning a counselor or a principal or something like that. Messaging the student on their computer, sending them a personalized message about what it's based on the behavior they just did, which is what you saw in those self-harm notifications. And finally, blocking the content. And I'd love to dive into each of these briefly. So this incident that we saw earlier, as I mentioned, was a real incident. But the school that had this happen had set up a trigger to automatically assign and notify the counselor of any student's closest counselor in their school. So the counselor of the high school of the student that had this happen was notified within seconds of the search occurring. That counselor, because she knew the parents so well, was able to call the parents, and they were able to find the young woman in the laundry room, and she was safe. And they were able to intervene and get her help. It all happened within seconds. And that's because the AI was using triggers able to decide who needed to be notified. The next is messaging a student. Now this one's really interesting. This was actually a suggestion that we did not come up with at all. This was one of our alpha members in this journey, and they said, I want to treat my older students like adults. And I want to, instead of blocking some things, I want to remind them that they should be good digital citizens. And so this is a way to keep something up on their screen, but not actually block the content. What we were amazed by, though, is the results that it had on the districts that tried it. And I just talked to Chris today about it. So this is the school that was getting, they were getting 500 explicit activity notifications per week, and they were blocking. And they decided to switch to messaging. And over the course of 2 days, they went from 500 to 100 explicit browsing behaviors simply by treating the students differently. It was phenomenal. We were super excited. But that said, there's also the idea of blocking content, which in itself is its own exciting kind of package. So let's talk about how we currently block content, right? It's through URLs. And as we mentioned, the URL is not the best way to understand what the content's about. The content can change. There can be a chat that pops up. None of that is described by the URL. But we have these gigantic blacklists and whitelists that we try to use to decide what to block. However, with AI, where it's able to determine what the content of the page is, you no longer need blacklists and whitelists. Suddenly you can just tell it what kind of content you want to block, and it does everything else for you. Your blacklists and whitelists suddenly just become a single rule. Explicit activity, don't want them looking at it, no more. So that last part can also be helped with tech. So I'm super excited to announce that this journey has coming to, I don't want to say an end, but it's coming to a milestone. It's being released publicly as a beta, as smart alerts in the latest version of GoGuardian admin. There's a lot of work that we still want to do in it, including working on things like cyberbullying, violence, drugs, alcohol, and even some more potentially exciting stuff. Thanks, everyone.